It has been more than 3 decades since I first sat down with Jock Gill. I was at the White House as a reporter working on a series on what was referred to as the Information Superhighway. He was Director of Special Projects in the Office of Media Affairs at the White House, leading the effort to evaluate new technologies, opening the doors to electronic communications and creating the first ever internet addresses for the President and Vice President. All these years later, here we are again for a look back at where that information highway has taken us and a look at maybe where we're going. Hi, Jock.
Greetings again.
Well, back then, you attempted to define the information superhighway as being all about communications, the ability to communicate with other people who share interests, needs, or relationships with you, communications on the job, in your private life, for recreation, for entertainment.
I think that over the next 10 or 20 years, the information infrastructure will richen and mature, and we will depend upon it, for our health, for our education, for on-the-job training, for lifelong learning. It's going to really affect many aspects of our lives, as well, of course, it's going to affect the way we approach entertainment and relaxation and the arts as well.
You talked about being able to see the birthday parties of your grandchildren from afar and have them be able to see you. You called it a two-way TV link back then, Jock. Well, this was decades before anything like Zoom or Skype, before FaceTime, before Facebook or X. You talked about students being able to learn and collaborate in all new ways. The doors to the information highway were through services back then like CompuServe, AOL, and Prodigy. Jock, in many ways, your vision of the future was spot on in a lot of ways.
In some ways, yes. I just want to make one quick correction. It was Linda Rathbone, who drove the email addresses for the president and the vice president in correspondence. She and I worked closely on many things, but she said, Jock is going live June 1st. And it did. So she was a very determined young woman and did a great job.
That's terrific. So describe for us what exactly you were doing there in the White House and how it felt. I mean, this was a young, new administration, with a lot of energy, the whole theme was looking to the future. Don't stop thinking about tomorrow, right?
Well, hindsight's a wonderful thing. But I would say if you really wanted to get a feel for what was going on, you had to remember that the campaign book in '92 was putting people first. And then you have to dig around and see if you can find a link to the NBC 1993 first 100 days. It's an eye-opener. I was interviewed a couple of years ago on a follow-up, which they just used a little bit of me, but they gave me a link and I watched it a couple of times. 1993 first 100 days. It was still full of optimism and still full of pretty much progressive thinking, but things changed, and we didn't understand. We were in a long conflict dating back at least to the end of World War I, and especially in the 1930s, where what I call the royalists, the conservative forces, were determined to undo Roosevelt and Francis Perkins. This is not what they wanted. And they were afraid for their status and their wealth. And they were trying to preserve that and protect that. They didn't want change because they're afraid change would diminish their status and their wealth and their privilege. So that's why I call them royalists. They were, because I like to go back to the American Revolution, that period from, say, 1776 forward 10 or 12 years, 15 years. Because you think about it, and this is key, I think, the people who did the Declaration of Independence in 1776 were a minority, and they were they were afraid they would fail, and they knew that if they failed, they'd be hung because they were traitors. They were rebels. But what they were daring, innovative people who challenged the status quo, did not want to modify the relationships with Great Britain, wanted to replace the relationships with Great Britain with a different model. And in the end, they were quite successful. I mean, we're sitting in a house from 1787.
I was going to say that here. We're sitting in history, this wonderful house you have here in Vermont, Jock.
Yeah, it's, this house was, the person who built this house built it after he'd been here 11 years. He came up in 76, Declaration of Independence. And when the war was over and the Constitution was up and running, he had the faith and courage and optimism to build a tavern. Because this was the military road, which was the road going north towards Canada for a potential Canadian invasion, until they realized the Canadians could come south. Oh, isn't that strange? Roads go both directions. But in any case, what I think is important to observe is that this degree of innovative thinking, and I think we'd say, people this era would say disruption, was what made America in the first place. And now we seem to be absolutely terrified of innovation of that type. We don't want, you look at the billionaires, for the most part, they're terrified of Musk as an example. They don't want innovation as in the American Revolution. They want rich white Christians to rule the world, and that's just might as well be the British Empire. So the question, to get back to your question, is, well, what happened in '93? Well, we had this start with various new technologies, and we pushed on them as best we could. But we were constrained by the fact that we were in a period of time that was dominated by neoliberal economics since at least 1980 with Reagan and Thatcher. And that was all about not changing. That was all about, don't mess with my toys, don't mess with my money, increase my money, give me bigger toys. It wasn't about the people, it was about the money. And I think the Clinton administration came in my belief, much more people-oriented. I mean, after all, the book was putting people first. But they ran into this environment that made it exceedingly difficult to proceed. So when we did
in Congress,
well,
there was a shift that started back in those days that continues to this day, a division in Washington that I don't know how we overcome it, but we're still in the midst of it. All right.
So, yeah, we're at peak Toryism, if you will. The Tories are running wild, but they're terrified of losing this coming election. What happened was we didn't have the context for success on a broad scale, because what we did when we put the World Wide Web, the White House on the web in '94, no one knew what we were doing, so nobody cared. It wasn't perceived as a threat or a challenge or as a radical innovation that would upend or whatever.
You showed me there in the White House Mosaic, this graphical interface to the internet.
But no one cared. No one knew. We used to say that Bill Clinton was a yellow legal pad kind of a guy. I had people, ambassadors come. My office was over in the old exec, but I was on the first floor and everybody walked by, so I go out and grab people to show them what we're doing. And I showed one ambassador what we were doing. He was very polite about it, but didn't pay it any mind. He came back a year or so later and said, "Jock, I was totally wrong. I should have listened to what you were saying." Because he finally figured out that that there were some changes here. But you go back in history, since there are a lot of people in this country concerned about religion, Jesus Christ was a radical. And he paid for it with his life. But he changed some things, but a lot of his changes over the last 2,000 years have been, shall we say, modified, sanitized, or whatever. But you go back, well, I don't know, you can pick your examples, but like time and time again, you take the Club of Rome in 1972 or 3, right? They wrote this book called Limits to Growth. It laid out the probabilities of different scenarios, and one of them was called business as usual. Laid it right out. And it's been the business as usual scenario has developed pretty much the way they said it might. It wasn't a prediction, it was a scenario. But it didn't cause radical change. Why not? You look at Al Gore. He spent 40-some years of his life, maybe longer, advocating for climate change action, documenting, illustrating, lecturing on the problems and the dangers of what I call climate transformation. Global warming is a terrible misnomer, but we are in the middle of climate transformation. We see it in hurricanes, we see it in forest fires, we see it in droughts. I mean, there are just many, many ways we see it, but particularly in the weather, and particularly in ocean temperatures, which are astronomically high. So the question is, why didn't people say, gosh, Mr. Gore, you're right, we really have to do something dramatic, and we really have to respond to this in a very serious way? Didn't happen. And why? There are other examples of people who've been seeing future events or future things. I mean, Galileo is a prime example. For example, it wasn't nice to say that the Earth went around the sun, because the given knowledge was the other way around. And what did he do? He went to jail or exile because he dared to say something counter to the status quo. And that's the key thing. If you say something counter to the status quo, you are in tricky territory. And Gore was there, the Club of Rome was there, and they didn't get the traction you would have hoped they'd gotten. Because if Club of Rome had gotten traction in 72 or in, say, early 70s, that's 25, it's 40 some years of work we could have been doing, but we didn't do it. And with Gore, it's been 40 some years of we could have been doing something, but we didn't. And I'm doing a lot of work now with rural telecom and work with electrification, and we can see all these things. And one of the questions is, why isn't there action akin to the reaction in World War II, or maybe the Moon Project, 10-year goal to get to the moon, which people thought was ridiculous. We did it, but they thought it was ridiculous when we started. Why aren't we treating the climate transformation problem with the same degree of national focus and attention? And I had an hour-and-a-half lunch with a woman who's a candidate for Senate, state Senate here, Amanda Cochran. And Amanda taught me a very interesting thing, which is you need to find things you can say yes to. It's not adequate to say that's bad or that's wrong or whatever. So you look at what Club of Rome did. They didn't have any positive vision to say yes to. They didn't have better options to say yes to. They could say, well, we ought to do this, we ought to cut down emissions, but they didn't have a positive message of a practical say yes to this. Gore had the same problem. He was too early in a sense. He didn't have affirmative, exciting visions of alternatives, of options that it would be exciting to say yes to. It was more about what we shouldn't be doing. And no, that's
So solar technology was nothing like what it is today in terms of expense, et cetera.
It's part of it. So, but, there's a guy named Tony Seba who I think is very smart. And he has a couple of examples. He has a famous example where he says, well, you see this big crowd of horses, at some big public meeting. Well, where's the car? Well, there's one car, and he circles it. He says, oh, well, it's interesting. And then about 12, 13 years later, he shows a similar picture and says, well, where's the horse? And it took 13 years roughly to go from essentially all horses to all, fossil fuel powered vehicles. So change can happen very, very fast if there is a strong advantage that's perceived and agreed to. And obviously, cities were drowning in horse manure and dead horses in 1890. They couldn't get rid of the manure fast enough. They couldn't get rid of the corpses fast enough. And they didn't know what to do, and the automobile solved the problem. Horses became either steaks for people or canned dog food for dogs. But no more manure in the streets and no more dead horses in the streets. It was a major thing. But Sieb has another example, which I think is more relevant to this conversation, which is, why did the first smartphones, if you want to call them that, emerge in 2007? Not '06, not '08. From two companies that had never ever made a phone before, Apple and Google. But Steve's explanation is because they were technology companies that saw that all of a sudden all the parts needed had converged and existed. You didn't have to all you had to do was put it together in the right way, and all of a sudden, presto, you had this product. So Jobs saw it, and the people in Google, whoever they were, saw it, and presto, in 2007. Well, that convergence of necessary aspects that would have supported Gore didn't exist. What we have today with the advances in PV, wind, and storage, and the advances in grid management, fractal microgrids and things like that, we now have the ability to say various components have come together at the same time in the same place. So now we can say, which I like to say is, okay, I would like an energy system that was, clean, healthy, particulate-free, and retail cost of about 5 cents per kilowatt, give or take a cent. We have all the technology to do that. That's been demonstrated. I mean, I make my own juice out back, and it's 11 cents, but that's only because in the United States, because of regulations and policy, it costs 3 times more money to install a watt of PV here in America than it does in Australia. So why are we shooting ourselves in the foot by making the cost of a residential watt so expensive to install? Don't know. But you divide my cost by 3 cents, and you get less than 5 cents. So we now have a vision. We can say, yes, I want energy that is clean, healthy, particulate-free. I don't want my energy source to drive up wicked healthcare costs for respiratory disease, which is the current situation. I'd like it to be resilient and robust. I'd like it to be highly recyclable and secure and distributed. Well, those are all possible today, except for regulations and policies, and except for the fact that distributed energy resource model is not popular with the Tories who like centralized control. So we need to start, those of us who are concerned about climate transformation, coming up with valid options that are possible today that we can say yes to. Because that's a really interesting story.
You've used the phrase radical disruption, I think, multiple times, and that from your perspective, is really what's needed here.
Well, let's put it this way. I did an interesting experiment. I mean, I have a new Google phone, and it comes with a year's worth of their advanced Gemini Advanced AI, although it's really, I call it IRS, Information Retrieval System. But I sent a very short query about do we replace or do we replace? Do we modify or do we replace? And I got this wonderful, I asked for 800 words. And I find if I ask for 800 word responses, I get far richer responses. All the same format, so that's boring, but much more interesting. And I will say that I picked 800 after a New Zealand television program called 800 Words. But I was starting with 1,000, I started with 400, and I said, oh, let's go with 800. But I did this query, and I may have sent it to you. If I haven't, I'll send it to you. And it basically says what Buckminster Fuller said, is if you have a problem, you don't modify it, you replace it. So what Google's Gemini Advanced said was, this is not about modifications, this is about replacements. This is not about going slow and gradual, which is comforting. It's about doing something dynamic. So I passed that around quite a while. I'll send you a copy. But it's really interesting that when you have major problems, you don't, you look back at the founding period. The founders didn't want to modify the relationship with the crown. They wanted to replace it. And that's why they were rebels. That's why they were radical and innovative. You could call them disruptive if you wanted to, but it's radical innovation that drives replacement. The car displaced the horse. The sun is in the center and the earth goes around it. Replaced, no, the sun goes around the earth. I mean, these replacements are really interesting. But going back to the web in 93, we didn't have that perspective. But we had a clue that we missed. Shortly after we did whitehouse.gov, someone did whitehouse.com because we didn't build a fence. And whitehouse.com was either porno or guns or both. I can't remember. I met the guy once at MIT years later, and we had a good laugh. But that should have tipped us off that there was just as much room for abuse of these or negative applications of web technology as there were positive ones. But we missed the clue.
And we've learned so much about, I love being able to see my high school classmates on Facebook, but there's a lot on Facebook I don't love, and other social networks too. When you think about AI, you mentioned it before, and what Google is doing, what Microsoft is doing, what others are doing as well, some of the benefits look mind-blowing. I mean, you mentioned asking it to come up with 800 words to solve a problem, but what it can do with medicine, with education, and many other areas as well are so promising. But even the people who are developing this have concerns, have worries, and the potential for misuse, as you're pointing out here, is so great that maybe people are going to say, no, we can't. We have to do away with this. We can't use this tool, even though it's probably too late to even think that way.
Well, first of all, it's not clear to me that it's intelligent at all. I mean, I ran a computer company in the early 80s, and we did a project for IBM of migrating their information retrieval system called STAIRS to a XT, which was not clear it could be done, but we did it. And in the course of doing that, we learned something about information retrieval. And basically, these products are large language models. They've scanned a lot of documents, and they fragment them into little bits. And they have got some algorithms for piecing them together. But in my view, and I'm deeply influenced by David Reed, who is very skeptical and doesn't think they're intelligent at all. He thinks they're a little bit like, was it Burroughs, who wrote a book that was all random stuff. They cut it up and put the random pieces together in a random way. He said that's what large language models are. They're no different from that approach. And they can They can give you answers. They can give you replies, not answers. They can reply with how they stitch together fragments of information they have studied. But if you've done information retrieval, you understand there are two conflicting goals. One is precision. I only want to get material that relates to my query. And the other is completeness. I want to get all the material that relates to mine. And when you ask Gemini, what do they do about precision and completeness, they give you a very straightforward technical answer. We try to balance it. What they're saying is, yes, we are constrained by precision and we're constrained by completeness, and we try to come up with some kind of a balance. So really, it's their glorified information retrieval systems, IRS.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean they can't pull together fragments that we might never think of pulling together. They might pull together fragments we didn't even know existed, and that can be really useful. But what I say about the results of the AI I get, or what I get from Gemini, is source, Gemini Advanced, catalyst. It's a catalyst for conversation, and it's a catalyst for constructive criticism. Did Gemini invent this stuff? Is it a hallucination? Did they pull together the right fragments? Did they miss fragments? And you often, if you know the field, you can often see where they miss fragments. And if you don't put in a word goal, 800 words, 400 words, whatever, you get more and more misses, less and less completeness, less and less precision. And so people who use these things, unless they understand precision and completeness, and unless they understand the field, and unless they ask for long replies, I mean, 800 words is what, 3 pages, 4 pages? Mm-hmm. They're seduced, and they're led astray. Or they can be seduced, and they can be led astray. So, in the computer business, there's at least when I was in it in the 80s, there's a saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
And we know these large language models ingest a lot of stuff with with some percentage, reasonably high, I suspect, of garbage.
And they're not taking out the trash.
They don't take out the trash. They even create trash, which they then ingest. I mean, you get the circular, I produce the trash, I ingest the trash, I produce the trash, I ingest the trash cycle. Come on, folks. This is not magic. It's not a silver bullet. It's a tool. And that's why I call it a catalyst.
Well, Jock, your perspective, your knowledge, thank you so much once again for sharing with us. Great to see you again after all these years. Thank you.
You're looking very healthy. Thank you. Yes, you're very welcome. It's always fun to talk with you. I mean, I did all the talking. I'm sorry. My wife chastised me.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah,
for you to do the talking.
Yeah, I understand that. But it is a real, I have grandchildren. You probably have grandchildren too. But I have grandchildren. I say, what the hell's going to happen to them? I mean, I'm 80 years old in February. And I'm thinking, okay, so maybe I got 10 years. Maybe I got 15 years. In 10 years, my oldest grandson will be 26. He'll be 25. And the step-granddaughter will be 26. They'll have 50 years in front of them, maybe. What will those 50 years be like? I don't want to be cursed by them for being, a fool. And for not facing up to my piece of the responsibility. I mean, I made those choices. I had a diesel Suburban. I love that diesel Suburban. It spewed particulates all over the damn place. We drove over 200,000 particulate spewing miles. Not good. We thought it was so smart because diesel was cheaper than gasoline and went further for a while. I mean, it's like wood pellets. I used to be a big fan of wood pellets. Not anymore. But I'm of the school, use it up, wear it out, then you replace it. But wood pellets cost more now than heating fuel. Crazy business. It's absolutely absurd. I mean, a gallon of oil, a gallon of oil is equal to a ton of pellets, roughly, in terms of energy content. So if a gallon of oil costs 100 gallons of oil is equal to a ton of pellets. That's what the math is. So if your pellets are $3.65 a ton, you're paying $3.65 oil. Well, I'm paying $3.40 something oil. So I'm paying extra to burn wood pellets. Why is that? I mean, it's just, we are so, that's why I bring up the thing about where are the people who have the courage and the innovation to be rebels, like the people in 1776 with Declaration of Independence. They were the minority. People thought they were stupid. And they did it for economic reasons. They thought the British were screwing them over economically, which probably they were. The East India Company was a terrible corporation. But where are the people today, the leadership today, willing to be as bold and innovative and risk-taking as the people who did Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights? Those are radical, disruptive ideas that made America great. Well, if we want to make America great again, we have to be willing to be as forward-looking and radical. Just speaking of such things, Adam Smith, of course, wrote The Wealth of Nations. It barely mentions the invisible hand. I think once, maybe twice at most. Well, he and Franklin met in England and talked and conversed. And I think Franklin was very impressed with what he did. And he came back, and it turns out most of the people of the early leadership in the colonies, the new colonies, the states, read Adam Smith. There's a George Washington first edition in the Princeton Library. George Washington signed, which is amazing. Franklin, I think, was right. The way The Wealth of Nations was written was fit agrarian America to a T. Small, distributed, local, But my understanding is that Smith didn't care for remote ownership. He didn't care for, remote wealth accumulation. He wanted local, distributed. So what we have for capitalism today is a perversion of what Adam Smith was writing about. People don't want to hear that either.
Well, from an historic home here in the hills of Vermont, very interesting perspective. Thank you so much, Jock.
You're very, very welcome.